So I just, before I started, want to give you guys a background a little bit on the main female sex hormones, just in case people are not aware of this, because this is certainly not a topic I knew about that much when I began my interest in this. I think a lot of our obstetrician and gynecologists and family planning experts tend to know a lot more about this field. But in general, the two main female sex hormones are estrogen and progesterone. And as most of you know, they'll vary in levels throughout the ovulatory cycles in women. And if you look at this bottom graph here of what the phases are of where these hormones are in the different parts of the cycle, there's when women are menstruating or having your cycle, the hormones are actually at their lowest level. So the red here represents estrogen and the green progesterone. As the phase of the cycle goes along, the estrogen starts to increase, and that leads to this peak in LH. This is the marker of actual ovulation. And then as time again goes along in the cycle, it's progesterone that starts to rise to the highest in what we call the luteal phase of the cycle. And if you look over here on these two charts of the estrogen levels and the progesterone levels, you can see that there's huge variations of where they are. So in the beginning, for example, in what we call the follicular phase, which is where menses occur, these levels can be as low as 30, which is what we can even see in a male. However, when people are hitting ovulation, they're nearly quadruple, if not more than that, in amount of these hormone levels. And similarly with progesterone, it varies tremendously as the cycle goes. So this is obviously leads to the hypothesis of what do these fluctuations do on health if we think these hormones are affecting people. This is just another graph so you can kind of see what happens when these different hormones are moving. So you can see that what actually occurs in the lining of the uterus is that when you're shedding your lining of your uterus, which is when menses is occurring, is when these hormones are lowest. Then when the actual egg is coming out of the fallopian tubes and you're actually undergoing ovulation where an egg is released, is when you get the peak of estrogen, and then the lining of the uterus is building back up as your progesterone level is rising. And this on the bottom right is just we're going to get into very small amounts of science here, but it's just to let you know that both of these hormones, estrogen and progesterone, work by acting on different receptors in the body. So they're this little purple, kind of, I don't know what you call it, like a horseshoe almost looking thing, is they're binding to these different estrogens and progesterones around the body. And these receptors, very importantly, don't just exist in female part, in terms of they don't just exist in gynecologic parts of the body. They don't just exist in the breast tissue. They actually exist in many, many tissues throughout the body. And very importantly, they exist in the lungs, and we know that. So when you have circulating hormones in the body, when it comes to estrogen and progesterone, they have the ability to bind to these receptors all over the body. All right, so then moving into other data that we know, this was actually a much more thorough look at some of this topic, and this was a big paper that came out of a group out of Ireland that was published in a huge medical journal called the New England Journal of Medicine in 2012, so really not that long ago. And what this group did was they took a large number of women from their own center in Ireland and tracked what the estrogen levels were in women's blood when they were having exacerbations. So this graph over here on the left is number of exacerbations and this different in their population of women over time when they're having exacerbation, and in red is what their estrogen levels were. So you can see that in terms of these numbers of exacerbation and days on the cycle, which they tracked here, they found that the highest number of exacerbations in these women tended to occur when they're about 5 to 12 days into their cycle. Now that's actually at that point where people are ovulating, when estrogen level, as you can see here that they found, is the highest. So they really hypothesized that somehow this increase in estrogen was maybe potentially contributing to higher rates of exacerbation in that point in the cycle. They also, on this right graph, looked again at exacerbations, and that is they looked at when people were stable, and they looked at when they were exacerbating, and they measured estrogen levels in the blood in women here in the black who had CF and were not on any oral hormone contraceptive therapy, in this clear white bubble in women with CF who are on hormone contraceptive therapy, And here in the gray, these in men as a control. And you can see in general that they found that women on hormone contraceptive therapy had an exacerbation rate that was actually lower than women who were not on hormone contraceptive therapy. And that, their hypothesis, again, was basically by being on hormone contraceptive therapy and by minimizing that ovulation spike you'll get with estrogen rising, that somehow this was associated with fewer exacerbations. Now, this was all association, meaning there was not any direct mechanism suggesting this was occurring, but just based on timing and estrogen levels and looking at their center and exacerbations, this is part of what they concluded. They also went on, and this is a pretty busy slide, and I'm just going to walk you through a little bit of this, is they also looked a little bit more in detail at Pseudomonas. And part of the reason they chose Pseudomonas aeruginosa is, as many of you guys may know, this is a very prevalent bacteria in cystic fibrosis. It tends to be associated with people doing not as well once you acquire this bacteria. And there had already been some evidence in the literature, which we talked about, showing that maybe women were more predisposed to Pseudomonas and that when they acquire it, they do as well. So what they actually found, they looked at Pseudomonas and they looked at what's called alginate, which is the production of a material that comes out of Pseudomonas when it's becoming a mucoid form. And they actually found over here that there are different types of estrogen, but they found that both the two most common forms of estrogen, estradiol and estriol, these two forms in these darker blue bars, both increase the prevalence of this production of this alginate, meaning it was somehow associated with more mucoidy formation. And that's visible in these pictures here, where when you look at actual colonies of Pseudomonas in a plate, they found that when you treated the Pseudomonas with estrogen, that it turned into more of a mucoid form, which is marked by this kind of globular look to the Pseudomonas that was not visible when they treated these with testosterone. And then they again went back and looked at their patients. You can see on these right-hand sides, I'm not going to go into all the details, and basically found that more women, particularly in the point where they're at their ovulation point, were in a more mucoid form of Pseudomonas than otherwise. And they hypothesized that because this can sometimes mean a more virulent form of Pseudomonas, not always, but this may be one explanation of why they were seeing people exacerbate more at that point of ovulation where estrogen's the highest. And this is probably one of the biggest studies we have to date looking at anything related to hormone contraceptive therapy and estrogen and how this may impact different markers of health, with the main thing they focused on being exacerbation. This was another article that really looked at CF mice. So these are mice that have been studied where they actually knock out the CF gene in these mice, and particularly in the lungs. Now, I'll tell you, the gut is spared the way these mice are developed, because otherwise the mice have a big difficulty living without the nutrition they need in certain techniques. But in general, the CF channel was entirely knocked out of the lungs in these different mice. And when these mice were infected with Pseudomonas aeruginosa, there was just basically on this top left, this is going back to those same Kaplan-Meier curves that you saw in the past, where this is female mice with CF versus male mice with CF that were infected with Pseudomonas. Then when you take these female mice and you actually remove the ovaries, take the hormones out of these mice so that you're just focusing on these female mice, and then you give them back estrogen, which is here in the red, versus progesterone in the green, versus this blue line where they have no estrogen or progesterone, you actually see that it was found that the estrogen-treated mice did not do as well as the others. So this is kind of one of the, another pointing to the fact that is estrogen somehow doing something a little bad to the immunity of these mice when they're infected with Pseudomonas. So then just looking a little bit further at what was found on some of this data, just looking at the, pictures of the lungs from these mice, these are very microscopic pictures, and it was found that the mice, when they had their hormones entirely knocked out, relative to the mice that got estrogen, there was generally more cells or more inflammatory cells in these mice. And this was just quantified in this bar graph with the amount of inflammation. And really the final piece from this paper was that when they tried to figure out what it was about these mice that they may not be doing as well, they not only concluded that there was more inflammation in the ones treated with estrogen, but they also found that in cells that are a huge part of the immune system called neutrophils in the body, that the neutrophils in both, in the mice, once they were treated with estrogen, and actually they even took neutrophils from women with CF and treated them with estrogen after the cells had come out, found that when you look at this graph of, again, kind of the amount of Pseudomonas over time with estrogen treatment, that there was more, meaning the neutrophils weren't able to kill the Pseudomonas as well. And this is actually just a trial that we're doing at our own site, where we're recruiting women with CF who are in their reproductive years and having regular cycles, and having them come in at different points in their cycles. And when you look at this graph on the bottom, we're having them come in at their menses, when again their estrogen and progesterone would be at the lowest, right near ovulation when their estrogen would be the highest, and then in their luteal phase when progesterone's at its highest. And this is in women not on any hormone contraceptive therapy at all. And we really focused on recruiting women who happen to not be on any hormone contraceptive therapy, because we didn't want people to have to come off for our study. And then if they wanted to or are willing, we started them on a hormone contraceptive therapy called low estrogen, which is a combination of a low dose estrogen progesterone therapy, to try to measure then that once their hormones became leveled on these therapies, and we again have them come in, could we determine whether this did anything to improve health, for example. And the different measures that we're looking at in this study are, we're measuring lung function on these different visits, we're measuring symptoms using a validated questionnaire, we're collecting sputum and sending this sputum off for inflammatory markers, for density of bacteria, for neutrophil counts, and we're actually even collecting sweat to see if this might change at these different points. And I'll just very quickly tell you our very preliminary results, and this is not at all finalized, because this is when we had a much smaller number of people, but just showing you in the beginning, I'll tell you first off, good news number one was that the hormones overall in the women we've looked at so far were where we expected them to be. There are obviously some women with some slight fluctuations, but estrogen and progesterone, and we even looked at testosterone, we looked at LH and FSH, these are all female sex hormones, were in good overall what would match the general population. So the good news is hormones are not generally different in women with CF than they are with men, but there's always exceptions. And when we just started to look at lung function over here on the right, you can see that we actually saw a little bit of a trend towards lung function being slightly lower at the point of ovulation, where estrogen would be its highest. We also have seen a little bit of a trend for lung function to be a little bit higher on the women that went on to hormone therapy, in this case, low estrogen. And actually, interestingly, when we looked at symptom scores, actually, so the lower the score, the worse someone's feeling, we actually found that symptoms actually reported quite a big difference of women that when they were ovulating, symptoms were a little bit worse, especially relative to when they went on hormone contraceptive therapy. Now, none of this is statistically different yet, and that's also largely due to the fact that there's small numbers on any of this, but it's an interesting trend that basically matches that group out of Ireland, where we're seeing that something about the estrogen peak, which is the point of ovulation, may be a point where people aren't doing as well. The other thing this shows is when we've looked at some of the sputum samples, just comparing women versus men, and in particular women when they're ovulating, so that highest estrogen point to men, we actually found a pretty big difference in some of the inflammatory markers, where women again have much more inflammation than age and lung function. But this is all very preliminary data, so we're hoping that we can have a little bit of good controlled information in the next year or two. But I'll tell you just anecdotally, in what my own patients tell me, I think there is going to be a lot of variation, where some women feel worse during their cycles, some people worse during ovulation, some people worse during pre-menses. So it's going to be a tough thing to nail down, but I think at least if we have a little bit of science behind it, then we can start thinking about what we could do in terms of treatment and therapies and how this may help people. And so I just want to kind of summarize what we talked about, and that is from what we know, at least from the bench side of preclinical data, whether it's cell data or mouse data, there's been some evidence that estrogen in particular may somehow be impacting immunity or an ability to fight off infections. And I think the most data comes out of Pseudomonas aeruginosa, but we don't know that any of this is unique to Pseudomonas aeruginosa. There's also some evidence that estrogen may be promoting inflammation, or at least being associated with higher levels of inflammation, that it may be associated with a negative impact on the air surface liquid, that's the ASL, and even on ion channel transport on the top of these cells. There's some clinical data out there that there's an association between higher estrogen levels and exacerbations in women with CF, and again, that there's an overlay of Pseudomonas and whether maybe estrogen may be impacting the Pseudomonas converting to this mucoid type of Pseudomonas. And finally, there's evidence that there is a distinct outcome difference in men and women with CF, and that this is occurring before lung transplant, meaning when a CF lung is in place, but not necessarily after a new lung has been put in place after a lung transplant. So that's really the information we know with a lot of gaps in it, and there are a lot of unknowns, and I think the discussion is going to focus on this a lot today, but that is, what is the real impact of hormone contraceptive therapy on health outcomes, both lung outcomes and non-lung outcomes. I focused a lot on lung outcomes today, but I think things such as what's the impact on the GI tract, what's the impact on mental health, what's the impact on everything is also very important. What do we know about menopause, and what can we find out about menopause in terms of the timing in women with CF, and what can we do to ameliorate any of the problems that may occur from menopause? And then again, what are the direct effects of hormones on things such as hemoptysis or coughing up blood, on things such as VTE, which is venous thromboembolism or clots, because there's been some association of hormones with clotting. What's the impact on bone density and osteoporosis? A lot of about estrogen, but we really know very little still about androgens, which are the testosterone category. For all we know, maybe testosterone is helping men, and somehow we need to think about, is there a way that women need to receive a little without all the adverse side effects? And or what do we need to find out about progesterone or even other sex hormones that I didn't get into today? But there's a whole host of information that we don't know.